Greetings to all my friends on my channel. And today we're going to be doing something slightly different. A friend and a member of this group asked me a question about the connection to his tape recorder. Specifically, his particular model was available with both single-ended and balanced outputs. And he selected to go with the RCAs, with the single-ended connectors. And the question today was whether he made the right choice or whether he should even maybe consider upgrading his machine to fully balanced connections. So today we're going to look at that question, and we're going to look at some fundamentals as well while trying to answer the question of whether you should really try to always get balanced connections for your tape machines. Or perhaps there is a different alternative. And yes, I know a lot of us been conditioned thinking that balance is always going to be better. And I'm not going to argue it at this point yet. But I would submit to you that there could be different cases. There could be cases when definitely balanced is better, but there could be other ones too. And this question should not be considered without referring to particular specific situation on hand. You may have situation with power amplifiers, preamplifiers, and other situation in your system where the balanced is purely and simply superior. But we are dealing here with tape recorders. And for the good or bad reason, tape recorders are different. For example, I have yet to see the single tape recorder which had a fully balanced circuit inside. Pretty much all the machines I know have single-ended circuits. And the way they're terminated might depend on some options or some objectives, but that's a different story. You see, what you have internal to the units, to pieces of electronic gear, and what you use for interfacing, those are not necessarily the same things. So today I will try to answer some of those questions, and I'm going to do it in a freestyle fashion. I don't have any material per se prepared for this presentation, so I will be making it up as I'm going. And hopefully you will find it interesting. Before we go that far, I would like to say a few words about my qualifications. I guess the natural question is, who are you to speak about balanced connections, balanced circuits, balanced in general? What do you know about it? And I would submit to you that I do know a little bit about it. The first 15 years of my professional experience were involved in military and instrumentation. And if you know that field, you will know that balanced circuits are pretty much the way of life in instrumentation. Be it pressure transducer, strain gauge transducer, or many other applications, your first reach would be for the balanced circuits. So I've been very well trained in that particular aspect of electronic design. However, after 15 years in that industry, I decided to do something a little bit more fun. And so in 1994 or 93, my partner and I, we formed a company. And perhaps you've seen this logo and you know, maybe even know the company name. As you can see, the first word in that name is balanced. So we pretty much staked our future and our reputation on the fact that we mostly would be doing balanced circuits. I certainly consider audio much more fun endeavor than electronic instrumentation. It is more freestyle, if you will, almost like improvisation. While serious electronic business is serious electronic business, there is not much room for fun. Yes, there are some challenges and rewards, but overall I like my work in audio field much, much more. So with all my experience, both in serious business and fun audio electronics, you might be surprised if I told you that sometimes balanced is not the right answer. And we'll try to see why and in what cases that might be true. The basic idea of balanced connection versus single-ended connection has to do with the desire of to separate from the dirty and noisy ground. The ground in your system is always something that carries a lot of different currents, be it air conditioner current, your home appliances, whatnot. But the bottom line is, if you separate from the ground, you potentially get cleaner, nicer environment. And that's true to a large extent. Given that, the next question would be, why are there no balanced tape recorders? And sure, some of you would say, of course there are. Look at my Studer. It's got balanced input connectors and it's got balanced output connectors. So it is a balanced recorder. I'm sorry, but it is not. Yes, it has balanced connectors. But inside, most of its audio circuit is simply single-ended. And the reason is purely the cost and complexity. Balanced circuits in many cases mean more components, higher complexity, and therefore higher cost. So many years ago, most people made the decision that internally to the tape recorders, there was no need for balanced connection, balanced circuits. Is it really true? Probably not. But the paradigm today is that pretty much all tape recorders are single-ended internally. And they just have our XLR balanced connectors stacked on the inputs and outputs. And the way those connectors are attached to the single-ended circuit has a lot to do with the sound quality of those recorders. To cut it to the chase, the ideal configuration for any internal circuitry would be fully balanced amplification stages connected to the XLR connector via two separate phases and having two independent output phases. That would be the pure implementation that has a lot of advantages, including common mode rejection, controllable gain, and whatnot. But as I mentioned to you, it makes life more complicated for the designer. So most of the designers would do it differently. So in most cases, this is what you would really see inside of the tape recorder. Your XLR connector will have one of its pins connected to ground internally. Therefore, the whole signal is applied between those two wires, and it is handled as a pure single-ended signal internally. So the question then becomes, what do you do at the output? If your internal signal is single-ended, but you would like, for some reason about which we're going to talk later, have an XLR connector, what do you do? And the answer is simple. You put differential amplifier in this configuration, and it takes single-ended input, reference to ground, and it produces two equal phases of output signal. Now, if you look at the signal at this point and signal here, they're not exactly a replica of each other. There's a lot of stuff that goes inside of this little block in order to produce a balanced output. And that something might be damaging to the sound. So in that sense, taking your signal from here might be beneficial to your sound quality. Yes, you lose the balanced output. You are now completely single-ended here. But you see, you avoid that extra complexity of this gain block, which could be very, very complicated, full of components, transistors, capacitors, resistors, whatnot. All of them will affect the sound. Just to jump forward, I can tell you that on some machines, this works. For example, if you consider the Studer, or actually Revox PR99, a very nice machine, it has balanced outputs. But what a lot of people have discovered was that it has the monitor output, which is purely single-ended, and it's taken from the point before all this mumbo-jumbo happened. And believe me, this is mumbo-jumbo. It's a whole circuit board full of components. So people discovered that by going this shorter route, they obtained better sound. This is, for example, the way I use my PR99. All you need to do essentially is just buy a very inexpensive DIN to RCA connectors or DIN to XLR connectors cables, which exist on Amazon or eBay, and you're done. There is some small penalty for that, of course. Everything has to have penalty. There is less gain on that output than on XLR outputs. But in most real systems, you have extra gain. So you can simply adjust your volume control position, and now you can enjoy better sound. Now, all that flies in the face of popular logic that tells you that balance is always better. To which I say, balanced is always better as long as it is done right. And here we have the case of it's done not right. Why is this block there? For specific reason, because this machine was designed to work in a studio environment where the XLRs and untied from ground signals are a must. You deal with long interface logic lines, and your cables may be hundreds of feet long. Therefore, all those concerns are very real. And you also have transformer output here, which makes you totally decoupled from the ground on this side. And ground loops in large systems can be devastating. That's one of the most difficult problems to troubleshoot in audio systems. When a customer calls you and says, I have buzz in my system as soon as I connect components together, you know that's a ground loop speaking. And believe me, in most cases, it's very, very difficult to troubleshoot because every system is different. And some systems may have pitfalls not visible to the user. So having transformer coupling here allows you to avoid all those ground reference, common ground, ground loops and ground problems, which is good, which is very, very important in the studio. But presumably you're not running studios in your house. In this case, this is the way to do. And going back to the original question, this is how that particular recorder in question is also done internally. The direct output is single-ended, but it's pure. It's not contaminated by anything. So the question then becomes, should you buy this option and install it in this machine and obtain the XLR connections? But at what penalty? So we discussed a little bit on the output side of the issue. But let's look at what's happening on the input. So you have some sort of amplification stage, and you have the playback head, which has two leads. How do you connect it? Very often you will hear a statement that playback head, just like a phono cartridge, is a balanced source. But it isn't. It is essentially what's properly called a floating source. It doesn't know what it is, whether it is connected in balanced way or single-ended. It can be used either way. And the funny things happen sometimes. Instead of connecting it like this, people will consider connecting it to the differential stage. So you do it this way, and it works. But the question is, does it give you anything? Yes, it might give you something if you have very long cables between the tape head and your circuit. And that's why in many tape recorders, the first amplification stage is placed right next to the playback head. It is placed in the head block. So those cables, those wires are extremely short. And from there, the life is easier. You can send the signal over distance to the amplification stages. But you still connect it in a single-ended way here. Possibly. The question is, why not always do it in a differential way? Well, let's consider this case, which is more pertinent to the case of external head preamps, which are often tube-based. You have essentially the dual triode in the first gain stage. And the question is, do you do it this way? Yes, you can do it this way. But what is the other option? Well, here it is. So if you have a dual triode at your disposal, it can be argued that this is a better way of using your resources. The two tubes are now connected in parallel, and therefore their noise is lower. That's a benefit of this circuitry. You still have the same gain, you don't lose any gain, but instead of higher noise, you get low noise and higher drive circuit. So if you ask me, that's my basic recommendation for the tape head preamps. And I'm using it this way in some of my preamps. Now, one question naturally popping up is, why is balanced better? And again, let's not talk about electronic instrumentation because we are operating in totally different environment here. What applies to oscilloscopes, signal generators, or whatnot, signal analyzers, does not apply to audio circuits. But we just spent some time describing interfacing structures. And that's one part of the equation. The other part is what happens inside your amplification modules or your circuit components, preamplifiers, power amplifiers, CD players. And there is definitely quite a bit of benefits derived from using internal circuits of balanced kind. We're not going to cover all those reasons here, but you just have to take my word that balanced circuits are inherently more symmetrical. They produce less distortion. And they also interface with the power supply in a very, very different way. For instance, this is a typical representation of single-ended gain stage. So you have the gain element, the load, and the power supply. And the signal is typically taken from here. That's a very simple circuit, but it's very common. Now, what happens when you apply signal to the input? The variations of signal will produce variations of current flowing through the loop, which means your power supply now have to accommodate all those current fluctuations. And it might sound like a simple task, but it is a monumental task. The quality of power supply is absolutely fantastically important in this case, and lousy power supply will prevent the currents, fluctuated currents, from freely flowing through the loop. So the demand on the power supply quality is very, very high in this case. And some of those power supplies can get quite expensive. So here is why things are different in balanced circuits. You see two gain elements with two inputs, and they're driven out of phase. You also have power supply supplying quiescent currents to each side. When you have signal fluctuations, they're opposite of phase. Therefore, when one current increases, the other one goes down by the same amount. Yes, you have to make sure that components are matched in the system, but as long as they are, this total current will be constant. Ideally, it's not going to be changing at all. What does it mean? It means that power supply now has a free ride. It's got very easy job. It doesn't have to accommodate all those quick and unpredictable fluctuations. It just supplies constant current. That's another beauty of balanced topology. Now, going back to the original question, whether this particular person should invest in the balanced output stage just to get XLR connectors, I think you're already getting my tilt that in this particular case, it probably doesn't make any sense. I pretty much bet my dollar that the output from his single-ended connector is going to be cleaner on his machine. So the question becomes, how do you connect it to your other components? Let's say the preamplifier. Fortunately, this particular person has single-ended preamplifier. So the question pretty much becomes a non-issue. You connect RCA to RCAs, and hopefully you don't have ground loops in your system, and you get wonderful sound. I presume that's how he's already using his system. But what if you have balanced preamplifier? How do you handle that configuration? And the answer to that question, unfortunately, is that depends. It entirely depends on the input configuration of your preamplifier. Just the fact that preamplifier has balanced inputs, it does not mean very much, because it can be configured many different ways internally. But there are some cases. If you are lucky and your preamplifier has a real, true balanced input, which usually also means it is differential, then you can do it this way. And that's pretty much all you need to do. In fact, that's how we advise a lot of our customers to connect their RCA-based equipment to our systems. We basically just make simple adapters doing this job. It's a simple plug-in adapter that works perfectly well in majority of the cases. So my best advice here is you need to talk to the producer of your preamplifier to find out what's his best recommended way of connecting RCAs to his inputs. In some cases, it might require additional circuitry or transformers or whatnot. But hopefully your case is very simple, just like that, which covers majority of devices out there. And pretty much the same applies to the outputs. And by this I mean don't presume anything. Please get on the phone and call the producer of your components and find out. Because you might be surprised, in some cases you will hear a very comfortable and very simple answer, but in other cases life may be a little bit more complicated. But it is better for you to find out upfront and not make any costly mistakes. I spend a lot of time talking to customers on the phone, and those type of questions that we discussed today are among the very common ones. So please, don't be shy. Call the manufacturer. And at this point, we are running out of time. I don't know if you have any additional questions. If you do, please post them. And who knows, maybe we can do part 2 of that particular discussion. So thank you for showing up again for this installment of my channel.